Hi, welcome to part two on our subunit related to Egyptian art. We're going to be looking at different modes of representation, and we're going to start with two-dimensional art. Two-dimensional art represented the world quite differently in Egyptian culture. Egyptian artists embraced the two-dimensional surface and attempted to provide the most representative aspects of each element in the scenes rather than attempting to create um, visuals that replicated the real world. So they weren't interested in depicting illusion or a sense of depth or reality. Um, each object or element in a scene was rendered from its most recognizable angle, and these were then grouped together to create the whole. This is why images of people show their face, waist, and limbs in profile, but eyes and shoulders frontally. These scenes are complex composite images that provide complete information about the various elements. So we talked a little bit about the composite view of often that royalty, as you can see here in this palette of Narmer. People of higher rank or royalty were often depicted in this composite view. Um, So these scenes are complex composite images that provide complete information about the various elements rather than ones designed from a single viewpoint, which would not be as comprehensive in the data they conveyed. So the idea was to communicate all this information. So it's quite sophisticated if you think about it, trying to sort of communicate all these different viewpoints and then combining them into this one composite view. Registers were important. We saw that with Mesopotamian art and the standard of or. Scenes were ordered in parallel lines known as registers. These registers separated the scene as well as provided ground lines for the figure. So in addition to dividing the scene and the narrative, it also provides a sort of a ground for these figures to stand on. Scenes without registers are unusual and were generally ones used to specifically evoke chaos. Battle and hunting scenes will often show the prey or foreign armies without ground lines. Registers were also used to convey information about the scenes. The higher up in the scene, the higher the status. Overlapping figures implied that the ones underneath or further away, um, as as are those elements that are higher within the register. So here we see, these enemies are depicted at the bottom. Hierarchy of scale. Difference in scale was the most common used method for conveying hierarchy. The larger the scale of the figures, the more important they were. Kings were often shown at the same scale as deities, but both are shown larger than the elite and far larger than the average Egyptian. So we can kind of in this palette of Narmer, we can kind of tell who is the king, who are members of maybe his court, and then obviously those that are not as high status, soldiers, slaves, and obviously the enemies. The use of text accompanied almost all images. In statuary, identifying text will appear on the back pillar or base, and relief usually had captions or longer text that complete and elaborate on the scenes. Hieroglyphs were often rendered as tiny works of art in themselves, even though these small pictures do not always stand for what they depict. Many are instead phonetic sounds. Some, however, are logographic, meaning they stand for an object or a concept. So, we often have hieroglyphs, that are, giving some sort of identifying information. Again, we're in this age of the written record, and hieroglyphs were an Egyptian way of recording text and documents. The lines blur between text and images in many cases. For instance, the name of a figure in the text on a statue will regularly omit the determinative, an unspoken sign at the end of a word that aids identification. For example, verbs of motion are followed by a pair of walking legs, names of men end with the image of a man, names of gods with the image of a seated god, etc., at the end of the names. In these instances, the representation itself serves this function. Religion focused on the cycle of life, earth, and rebirth in the afterlife. Because of Egypt's stability and longevity, its politics and religion appealed to the unchanging and the linear. If a king was depicted with the incorrect ritual implement, the ritual would be incorrect and could have dire consequences in the afterlife. Because of this notion, this led to an active resistance, again, to this change and these sort of codified depictions. Um, so what you're looking at is a palette that depicts the unification of Lower and Upper Egypt. Egyptian theology centered around the pharaohs, which are kings who placated the gods, petitioned the gods, and even became, in some instances, another kind of god in themselves. Most pharaohs accepted Mat, which is this idea of right and order and harmony. They brought it to their kingdom and were subject to it themselves. And so Mot is spelled M-A with an apostrophe A-T. So Mot was a sort of concept of order and harmony that everyone should try to embellish. So this is probably one of the most visually important Egyptian objects that we've ever found. Some artifacts are of such vital importance to the understanding of ancient culture that they are truly unique and sometimes and utterly irreplaceable. The gold mask of Tutankhamun was allowed to leave Egypt for display overseas. The Narmer palette or palette of Narmer, which you're looking at right now, on the other hand, is so valuable that it has never been permitted to leave the country. Discovered among a group of sacred implements ritually buried in a deposit within an early temple of the falcon god Horus at the site of Hierakonpolis, the capital of Egypt during the pre-dynastic period. This large ceremonial object is one of the most important artifacts drawn from the dawn of Egyptian civilization. The beautifully carved palette is more than 2 feet high in height, so it's actually pretty large. And so it's a ceremonial object. Um, and it's made of a smooth grayish green siltstone. It's decorated on both sides with detailed low relief. These scenes show a king identified by the name as Narmer and a series of ambiguous scenes that have been difficult to interpret and have resulted in a number of theories regarding their meaning. The high quality of the workmanship, its original function as a ritual object dedicated to a god, and the complexity of the imagery clearly indicate that this was a significant object, but a satisfactory interpretation of the scenes has been elusive. So this is a palette. So what was it used for? The object itself is a monumental version of a type of daily used item commonly found in the pre-dynastic period. Palettes were generally flat, minimally decorated stone objects used for grinding and mixing minerals for cosmetics. Dark eyeliner was an essential aspect of life in the sun-drenched region, like the dark streaks placed under the eyes of modern athletes. Black cosmetics around the eyes served to reduce the glare. So basic cosmetic palettes were among the typical grave goods found during this early era. This one is actually pretty large, so it wasn't actually intended to be used like in the real life, but it's a ceremonial object that the deceased person could use or symbolically use in the afterlife. So this work of art is dating from the early dynastic period, and I know that might be confusing. So this is before any of the kingdoms. So what pre-dynastic means is the before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt because they were both divided. And then when once we get past this work of art, then we get into the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, which we're not going to really look at any artwork, and then the New Kingdom and Late Kingdom. And so this was discovered in the Temple of Horus in Hierakonpolis. I know I'm saying that wrong, which was, a temple represents the unification of Egypt, which takes place around 3000 BCE, and really is the beginning of the country's growth as a powerful nation state. Um, And so what we see here is the depiction of a king. Kings in Egypt were complex intermediaries that existed in both the familiar and divine realms. The Ka, or spirit, was often depicted as a separate entity standing behind the human ruler. So a lot of you were able to immediately pick out the Ka. So we have Horus, the bird-headed god. In this case, he's sort of standing in front of the ruler. Um, the shallow relief carved on both sides of this carefully shaped slab of stone portrays scenes and symbols related to an early ruler of unified ancient Egypt named Narmer. All the figures, symbols, and objects presented on the palette are carved in shallow relief and silhouetted against a black background to ensure that the details of setting do not distract from their prominence. And so you don't have a cluttered background. It's nice and smooth so that we can pay attention to these symbols in Egyptian iconography. So we have this idea of symbolism used to convey narrative. We talked a little bit about narrative devices with Mesopotamian art and in particular the standard of war. And so we have these symbols that are used to convey a narrative. Um, One could be this historical unification of Egypt. So this is actually depicting a historical event. Other theories are this idea of a mythological unification, that this was sort of a supernatural or some sort of divine unification or some divine intervention with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. And maybe a daily journey of the sun god Ra, and or a balance between order and chaos that lies at the heart of Egyptian religion. So maybe, it's, a duality between those two concepts. The unification is also signaled by the two different crowns worn by Narmer, one claiming his dominion over Lower Egypt and the other over Upper Egypt. Here you see a representation. So a crown that looks like this is signaling Upper Egypt, a crown with this sort of concave and this sort of little curly extension is a crown of the pharaohs of Lower Egypt. And then we'll see that the two crowns become combined, representing the unification of Egypt. We'll talk a little bit more about that. On the front side, we see the pharaoh wearing the crown of Upper Egypt right here. And he is portrayed as fit and in good shape and wears a false beard. So these are some of the conventions of depicting pharaohs. In front of him is the falcon god Horus. And note, it's hard to kind of see, so I suggest you zoom in, is a human arm extending from the bird's body. It looks like he's almost kicking a leg, but it's actually a human arm. Um, to take captive a papyrus plant, um, which is depicted, I think, here, which is another symbol of Lower Egypt. Again, the use of hierarchic scale on both sides of the palette signals the importance of Narmer by showing him overwhelmingly larger than the other figures around him. Narmer and his retinue or court are portrayed in conceptual composite poses that show each part of the body from its most characteristic viewpoint. Heads are shown in profile to capture most clearly the nose, forehead, and chin, whereas eyes, and actually where that's something I kind of messed up on class. So the actual head, the direction of the head is in profile, but the eye is actually portrayed frontally. And so these are, viewpoints from their most recognizable and expressive angle. Hips, legs, and feet are drawn in profile, and the figures are striding to reveal both legs. So they're moving forward to reveal both legs. The torso, however, is turned to present a frontal view. And remember, we tried to sort of actually do this pose, this composite pose in class, and it was actually quite uncomfortable and difficult to do. So this composite view becomes a convention for portraying pharaohs. Persons of lesser social rank, such as servants or laborers engaged in active tasks, tend to be represented in ways that seem to us more naturalistic and lifelike. Narmer's standard bearers and the two figures who restrain lions over on the other side of the palette here. Um, seem to they appear in fuller profile view, and they actually have foreshortened torsos that seem more naturalistic. One figure named by the hieroglyphic inscriptions and standing on his own ground line is holds the king's sandals. So we're looking back over here on this part of the side of the palette. And Narmer is barefoot, if you notice here, because he's standing on sacred ground, performing sacred acts. Um, and again, he appears on the other side of the palette, and we'll look at, and you can see here he's wearing the crown of Lower Egypt. So here the sandal bearer is depicted on his own ground line. So he's, and he's smaller, so he's less important than Narmer, but he's also, holding the king's sandal. So that's a pretty important um, servant's position. So he is, depicted in composite view. Phonetic hieroglyphs centered at the top of each side of the palette, named, and they mean the name king, a horizontal fish, and again, it's kind of hard to see these. I think I can zoom in. I'm afraid I'm going to mess it up. Hold on. Um, to zoom in when you look on your own, but I'm afraid I'm going to mess up. Um, but these are phonetic hieroglyphs, and so there's a horizontal fish, which is called nar, and above a vertical chisel called, and that's the sound mer. So Narmer, and it's phonetically spelling his name. A depiction of a royal palace. Um, I think this is the fish and the chisel, and this is the royal palace. Um, Seen simultaneously from above as a ground plan and frontally as a facade. So remember, they were good at incorporating multiple viewpoints. Surround Narmer's name to signify that he is king. So I think this is what we need to look at. Let me see if I can zoom in. Okay. So I think it's the same on both sides. So yeah, here's the fish, and then you have this sort of weird looking for like floor plan, but also this sort of facade or entryway of a palace. So it's important for us to remember that these conventions that we've noticed remain the same for thousands of years. And there are several reasons why the Narmer palette is considered to be so important, and that's why. First, it is one of the very few such palettes discovered in a controlled excavation. Second, there are a number of formal and iconographic characteristics appearing on the Narmer palette that remain conventional in Egyptian two-dimensional art for the following 3 millennia. So that's like 3,000 years. These include the way the figures are represented, the scenes being organized in regular horizontal zones known as registers, and the use of hierarchic scale to indicate relative importance of individuals. In addition, much of the regalia worn by the king, such as crowns, kilts, a royal beard or a false beard, a bull tail, as well as other visual elements such as the pose of Narmer takes as one of the faces where he grasps an enemy by the hair and prepares to smash his skull with a mace, continues to be utilized from this time all the way through the Roman era. So that's pretty impressive that these stylistic conventions remained very um, unchangeable. And because there's so much going on the palette, this is a nice um, image that kind of gives you a little chart of what each icon or figure or hieroglyph talks about. So this is a really good source. So we'll just kind of review it again. So again, we have the king. He's represented twice in human form, once on each face or side, followed by his sandal bearer. He may be represented as a powerful bull, which we see at the top, just or here down at the bottom, um, destroying a walled city with his massive horns in a mode that again becomes conventional. Pharaoh is regularly referred to as strong bull. So there's another indication of the king or representation of him, and you can see him sort of mowing down the enemy. In addition to the primary scenes, the palette includes a pair of fantastic creatures known as sauropods. Um, and and I said they were lions. They're actually leopards with long, snaky necks who are collared and controlled by a pair of attendants. Their necks intertwine and define the recess where the makeup preparation took place. So this is the actual part of the palette where they would grind the minerals for the eye makeup. The lowest register on both sides includes images of dead foes, while both uppermost registers display hybrid human bullheads and the name of the king. The frontal bullheads are likely connected to a sky goddess known as Bat and are related to heaven and the horizon. The name of the king, written hieroglyphically as a catfish and a chisel within the squared element, which was supposed to be a palace facade, represents the king's name. Again, we see this side too, and again, a nice little chart sort of laying out the different meanings and interpretations of what these icons represent. So there have been a number of theories related to the scenes carved on this palette. Some have interpreted the battle scene as a historical narrative, or this initial unification of Egypt under one ruler, supported by the general timing, as this was the period of the unification, and the fact that Narmer sports the crown connected to Upper Egypt on one side of the palette and the crown of Lower Egypt on the other. This is the first preserved example where both crowns are used by the same ruler. So that's something else to think about. So on both sides, it's not two different rulers. It's the same person wearing both crowns. So again, signaling perhaps this unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Other theories suggest that rather than an actual historical representation, these scenes were purely ceremonial and just related to the sort of concept of the unification in general. So this may be this sort of mystical story or mythological story about the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Another interpretation could be the sun and the king. These are Egyptian symbols. There is some recent research on the decorative program um, connecting the imagery to the careful balance of order and chaos. And we talked a little bit about this at the beginning, known as Mot and Isfat or Isfat. Mot is spelled M-A''A'-T and Isfat E-I-S-E-I. I'm sorry, I'm tired. I-S-F-E-T. That was a fundamental element of Egyptian ideas of the cosmos. It may also be related to the daily journey of the sun god that becomes a central aspect in Egyptian religion in subsequent centuries. Um, the scene showing Narmer wearing the lower Egyptian red crown with its distinctive curl, so here's a detail of it here, depicts him processing towards the decapitated bodies of his foes. The two rows of prone bodies are placed below an image of a high powered boat preparing to pass through an open gate. Um, this may be an early reference to the journey of the sun god in his boat. In later text, the red crown is connected with bloody battles fought by the sun god just before the rosy-fingered dawn of his daily journey, and the scene may well be related to this. It is interesting to note that the foes are shown as not only executed, but rendered completely impotent. They're castrated. Um, their, their castrated penises have been placed atop their severed heads. So it's kind of hard to see. Let me see if I can zoom in. It's pretty brutal. We talked about the heads being, decapitated and being in between their legs, but apparently their penises are also lying there as well. So that's pretty brutal and intense. Seems like you really didn't want to mess with Narmer. So let's turn back to the other detail of the front side or the other side of the palette. So here we see Narmer wearing the Upper Egyptian white crown, and it would have been depicted as white, which looks rather like a bowling pin, as he grasps a foe by the hair and prepares to crush his skull. The white crown is related to the dazzling brilliance of the full midday sun, as it is as sun at its zenith, as well as the luminous nocturnal light of the stars and moons. By wearing both crowns, Narmer may not only be ceremonial, expressing his dominance over the unified Egypt, but also the early importance of the solar cycle and the king's role in this daily process. This fascinating object is an incredible example of early Egyptian art. The imagery preserved on this palette provides a peek ahead to the richness of both the visual aspect and the religious concepts that developed in ensuring these different periods in Egyptian culture. It is a vitally important artifact of extreme significance for our understanding of the development of Egyptian culture on multiple levels. So it's a really important one for you guys to know and know well. So here is the symbols of the crown. It's going to be important that we really understand these because we are going to eventually see them unify into this crown at the bottom. So the red crown of Lower Egypt and the white crown of Upper Egypt were the earliest crowns worn by the kings and were closely connected with the unification of the country that sparked the full-blown Egyptian civilization. The earliest representation of them worn by the same ruler is that of Narmer in the palette of Narmer, signifying that the king was ruling over both areas of the country. Soon after the unification, the fifth ruler of the first dynasty is shown wearing the two crowns simultaneously combined into one. This crown, often referred to as a double crown or the double crowns, remains a primary crown worn by pharaohs throughout Egyptian history. So we'll see this type of crown. The separate red and white crowns, however, continue to be worn as well and retain their geographical connections. There are a number of Egyptian words used for these crowns, 9 for the white and 11 for the red, but the most common, Desheret and Hedjet, refer to the colors red and white. You don't have to know how to spell those. I just wanted to tell you, um, respectively. It is from these identifying terms that we take their modern name. Early texts make it clear that these crowns were believed to be imbued with divine power and were personified as goddesses. So these were actually sort of, you know, they were deities essentially. All right. So in review, some stylistic conventions I want you to remember are hierarchic scale, composite perspective, narrative registers, and then really think about how the iconography is both religious and political. So one thing I want you to think about, what are two general ways the palette reinforces the pharaoh's power and authority? So this is something that we might talk about in class. Um, so stay tuned, and we'll be looking at Old Kingdom statues in our next unit.